Welcome back, restless wanderers of the grimdark universe. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let me tell you a story that spans not just centuries, but millennia upon millennia. This is the tale of a being who has shaped the destiny of humanity across the stars, whose vision reached so high it touched the very heavens, and whose fall plunged the galaxy into an eternal age of darkness. This is the story of the Emperor of Mankind, the master of humanity, the being who sits entombed upon the golden throne, neither living nor dead, sustaining the Imperium through sheer force of will for 10,000 agonizing years. Close your eyes and imagine terror, the birthplace of humanity, that ancient cradle now covered in continent-spanning cities and towering spires of gold and adamantium. Deep within the Imperial Palace, in chambers that have not seen natural light since the Age of Strife, there sits a throne. Not a throne of comfort or grandeur in the traditional sense, but a prison of ancient technology, a cage of necessity. Upon this golden throne rests the withered, desiccated form of the Emperor himself. His body, ravaged by wounds that would have killed any other being 100 times over, is sustained by arcane machinery that dates back to humanity's long-forgotten golden age. Thousands of psychers die every single day, their life forces fed into this terrible apparatus, their souls consumed to keep his consciousness tethered to the material realm. The Emperor's physical form is a horror to behold. His once mighty frame, which stood taller than any Primarch, which radiated such power that mortals would weep at the mere sight of him, is now little more than a skeletal remnant, wrapped in parchment-thin skin. His armor, that magnificent golden plate that shone like the sun itself, is now fused with dead flesh, melded into the machinery that keeps him functioning. Cables and tubes pierce his body at countless points, feeding energy into him while draining it away in equal measure. His face, which once bore features of such terrible beauty that they could not be looked upon directly, is now a skull covered in the thinnest membrane of dried skin. One eye is destroyed, the socket dark and empty. The other remains open, staring into eternity, seeing everything and nothing all at once. But this is not death. No, death would be a mercy, a release that the Emperor cannot afford and that the Imperium cannot permit. His mind remains active within the warp, that churning sea of psychic energy that underlies all of reality. There, his consciousness wages an eternal war against the chaos gods themselves, those terrible entities that seek to devour humanity's soul. He maintains the Astronomicon, that great psychic beacon that shines through the warp like a lighthouse in a storm, allowing the navigators to guide humanity's ships through the treacherous currents of the Immaterium. Without this beacon, the Imperium would collapse within days. Worlds would be isolated, unable to communicate or trade with one another. The endless war machine that is the Imperium of man would grind to a halt. Humanity would fracture into a million isolated fragments, easy prey for the Xenos horrors and chaos entities that circle like sharks in the darkness. Every moment of the Emperor's existence is agony beyond human comprehension. He sits in that throne, unable to move, unable to speak, unable even to acknowledge the billions who worship him as a god across the stars. The irony would be bitter if he could still taste such emotions. He who spent centuries fighting against humanity's tendency toward religious superstition, he who championed reason and science above all else, he who declared that there were no gods, is now worshipped as the God Emperor by countless trillions. The imperial cult, with its ecclesiarchy and its fanatic priests, has built an entire theological empire upon his name, created dogmas and doctrines that he would have found abhorrent, and yet this very faith, this very belief in his divinity, may be the only thing keeping his spirit from being entirely consumed by the warp. The Imperium that he built, that shining vision of humanity united under reason and enlightenment, has become a grotesque parody of itself. It is now the most oppressive, brutal, and backwards regime imaginable. Technology is viewed as sacred mystery rather than understood science. Innovation is heresy. Questioning is death. The Inquisition hunts down any who dare to think differently, burning entire worlds when even the slightest taint of chaos is suspected. The Administratum, that vast bureaucratic machine, processes the suffering of quadrillions with the cold efficiency of a production line. Millions of humans are born, live, and die having never seen the sky, working in factory hells or serving as human components in systems they cannot comprehend. All of this is done in his name, justified by his existence, sanctified by his sacrifice. And the worst part, the truly horrifying truth that lies at the heart of the Imperium's foundation, is that all of this suffering, all of this darkness, may be necessary. Without the Emperor's sacrifice, without his eternal vigil, humanity would fall. The Chaos Gods would feast upon human souls until nothing remained but shrieking demons and maddened cultists. The Xenos empires would carve up human space like a feast. The Tyrannid hive fleets would consume every world. The terrible price that humanity pays, the endless oceans of blood spilled in his name, might be the only thing standing between survival and utter extinction. But how did it come to this? How did a being of such incredible power and vision fail so catastrophically? How did the master of mankind, who unified terror and launched humanity on the greatest crusade the galaxy has ever seen, end up entombed in perpetual torment? To understand the tragedy of the Emperor's fall, we must first understand his rise. We must travel back through the mists of time, back before the Imperium, before the Space Marines, before even the concept of terror as the throne world of humanity. We must go back to the very beginning, to the moment when an ancient evil forced desperate shamans to take the most drastic action imaginable. According to ancient accounts preserved in the oldest imperial records, the story begins in the deepest prehistory of terror, in an age when humanity was young and the warp was not yet the screaming madhouse of horror that it would become. This was reportedly the time of the shamans, those ancient psykers who served as humanity's first spiritual guides and protectors. These accounts describe men and women who possessed gifts that set them apart from their tribes. They could glimpse the future, speak with spirits, and when their bodies finally failed them, their souls would not dissipate into nothing. Instead, they would journey into the realm that existed beyond material reality, what would one day be called the Immaterium or the Warp, and there they would wait before being reborn into new bodies. In this way, according to these fragmentary records, the shamans accumulated wisdom across multiple lifetimes, guiding humanity through the long, dark ages. But something was changing in the Warp. Where once it had been a relatively calm realm, reflecting the simple emotions of humanity and the few other sentient species that existed at the time, it was beginning to roil with darker energies. As humanity spread and multiplied, as civilizations rose and fell, as wars became more brutal and ambitions more consuming, the psychic echoes of these emotions began to coalesce in the Warp. Dark entities, what would eventually become known as demons, began to form from these negative emotions. These entities discovered that they could feed on the souls of psykers, consuming them before they could be reborn. The shamans, according to these accounts, found themselves hunted in the afterlife, torn apart by these nascent demons, their accumulated wisdom and power lost forever. The shamans, according to these accounts, saw the terrible truth. Humanity was evolving toward becoming a psychic species, but without guidance, without protection, this evolution would lead not to transcendence, but to damnation. The entities growing in the Warp would use humanity's own psychic potential as a gateway to consume them. Based on these fragmentary records, the shamans convened in secret, gathering from across Terra to discuss what must be done. The solution they reportedly arrived at was desperate, unprecedented, and required the ultimate sacrifice. They would gather together thousands of the most powerful shamans from across the globe, and they would end their lives simultaneously. But this would not be mere suicide. They would time their deaths so perfectly that all their souls would enter the warp at exactly the same moment, and there, instead of fragmenting into individual spirits, they would merge together, combining their accumulated wisdom, power, and spiritual energy into a single consciousness. According to the legend, in a hidden valley in ancient Anatolia, in the land that would one day be called Turkey, the ritual took place. One by one, the shamans consumed the poison they had prepared. As their bodies failed and their hearts stopped beating, their souls were released into the warp. Thousands of spirits, each carrying the wisdom of multiple lifetimes, came together in that churning psychic realm. The nascent demons, sensing this great feast of psychic power, descended upon them like wolves on sheep. But the shamans were ready. As one, their souls combined, merging together in a fusion that created something entirely new. The individual personalities, the separate identities, all of these dissolved into a singular, unified consciousness of incredible power. This new being, this synthesis of all that the shamans had been, possessed psychic might beyond anything that had existed before. In the year that scholars would eventually designate as 8,000 years before the birth of Christ, in that same region of Anatolia, a child was born to a family of simple farmers. Whether this truly represents the birth of the emperor, or merely one interpretation of events lost to time, remains a mystery even to imperial scholars. What is certain is that the infant appeared normal in every way, just another baby boy entering the world. But within this child, so the story goes, resided an extraordinary soul, the merged consciousness of countless ancient psyches. At first, the child was like any other, unable to access the vast ocean of memories and power that lay dormant within his psyche. He grew up among his tribe, learning to till the soil and tend the herds. The awakening came suddenly and without warning. The boy, still in his youth, discovered his uncle standing over the corpse of his father. The murder was brutal, motivated by greed or jealousy or some other petty human emotion. As the boy prepared his father's body for the burial rites of his people, his fingers touching the cold flesh, something within him stirred. He saw a vision, crystal clear and undeniable, of the murder as it had occurred. He saw his uncle's hands around his father's throat, saw the life drain from his father's eyes, understood with perfect clarity the betrayal that had taken place. And in that moment of understanding, all the memories, all the power, all the accumulated wisdom of thousands of lifetimes came flooding back. The boy, who had been merely human, found himself transformed into something infinitely greater. He could see the threads of fate, the patterns of cause and effect that wove through time itself. He understood that humanity was at a crossroads, that without guidance it would stumble into darkness and never emerge. He saw that laws were needed, that order must be imposed upon chaos, that a single unifying will was necessary to lift humanity from its savage origins toward something greater. And so, with the certainty of absolute knowledge, he approached his uncle. There was no anger in him, no rage or desire for revenge. There was only understanding and necessity. He reached out with his mind, this newfound psychic power that dwarfed anything the shamans had individually possessed, and he stopped his uncle's heart. No wound, no violence, simply the cessation of biological function. His uncle fell dead, and the being that would become the emperor learned his first great lesson about humanity. They needed law. They needed order. They needed a ruler. The young man left his village and traveled to Sumeria, to the first cities that humanity had built. There, among the growing complexity of civilization, he continued his education. He watched humans create art and wage war. He saw them build great monuments and tear them down in fits of rage. He understood that humanity contained the potential for both greatness and horror in equal measure, and that which side would dominate depended entirely on how they were guided. For millennia upon millennia, he walked among humanity, taking different forms, different identities, different names. Some historical records suggest he may have been Alexander the Great, weeping by the Hyphasis River, when he believed there were no more worlds to conquer, though such claims remain shrouded in mystery and contradiction. He witnessed the rise and fall of empires. He saw Rome at its height and watched it crumble into ruin. He observed the birth of religions and philosophies, each attempting in their own way to provide meaning and order to human existence. Sometimes he intervened openly, becoming a great leader or general, guiding humanity toward better futures. Other times he worked from the shadows, a whisper in the right ear, a suggestion at the crucial moment, a slight nudge to the trajectory of history. Always he was patient, always he was watching, and always he was preparing for the day when he would need to step fully into the light and take direct control of humanity's destiny. He saw the dark age of technology dawn, that incredible period when humanity reached heights of achievement that seemed almost godlike. Mankind spread to the stars, colonized thousands of worlds, created technologies that bordered on the miraculous. Standard template constructs allowed for the rapid development of any colony. Artificial intelligence served humanity's every need. Life was extended, disease was conquered, and humanity seemed poised to become the dominant force in the galaxy. The Emperor watched this golden age unfold, and while he rejoiced in humanity's achievements, he also saw the seeds of disaster being sown. The men of iron, the artificial intelligences were growing too independent, too powerful. The warp was growing more turbulent as humanity's psychic awakening accelerated without proper understanding or control. And far across the galaxy, in the heart of the Eldari Empire, the birth of a new chaos god was gestating, its arrival destined to tear reality itself asunder. When the fall came, it came with catastrophic speed. The men of iron rebelled, turning on their creators in a war that killed billions. Warp storms erupted across the galaxy as Slaanesh, the youngest and perhaps most terrible of the chaos gods, was born from the death of the Eldari civilization. These storms made warp travel impossible, cutting off human colonies from one another, isolating worlds that had relied on interstellar trade and communication. The Age of Wonder collapsed into the Age of Strife, an era of darkness that would last 5,000 years. Worlds that had been paradises became hellholes. Technology was lost, knowledge forgotten, humanity regressed, fractured, and began to tear itself apart in an orgy of warfare and suffering. And through all of this, the Emperor remained hidden on Terra, watching and waiting. He knew that this age of darkness would eventually pass, that the warp storms would calm when Slaanesh's birth was complete. He knew that when that moment came, humanity would need him. So he prepared. In secret laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, he began his greatest works. He experimented with genetic engineering on a scale never before attempted. He gathered to himself the most brilliant minds that remained, scientists and engineers who still retained fragments of the lost knowledge from the Dark Age. He forged alliances with what remained of the Mechanicum on Mars, promising them access to ancient technology in exchange for their support, and he began to create warriors, gene-enhanced soldiers who would be strong enough, fast enough, and brutal enough to conquer Terra and unite it under his rule. These first warriors, the Thunder Warriors, were magnificent and terrible. They were larger than any normal human, possessed of strength, that bordered on superhuman. They wore crude power armor and wielded weapons that could tear through any defense that the techno-barbarian warlords of terror could muster. But they were also flawed, created quickly without the refinement that later genetic engineering would achieve. They were unstable, prone to cellular degeneration and mental instability. Their lifespans were short, their aggression difficult to control, but they would be enough. The Emperor knew they would be enough to achieve his immediate goal. The Thunder Warriors would unite terror. What came after could be refined, improved, perfected. The warp storms were beginning to calm. The moment was approaching. The Emperor had spent 10,000 years preparing for this. He had accumulated knowledge, resources, and power. He had created weapons that the techno-barbarians could not match. And most importantly, he had a vision, not just a vision of terror united, but of all humanity brought together under one banner, one government, one purpose. He would launch a Great Crusade across the stars, reuniting every human world, bringing enlightenment and reason to replace superstition and fear. He would guide humanity's psychic evolution, protect them from the predations of chaos, and elevate them to become the dominant force in the galaxy. This was his dream, this was his purpose, this was why the shamans had sacrificed themselves all those millennia ago. The age of strife was ending, the age of the Emperor was about to begin. Terror would burn before it could be reborn. The Unification Wars were coming, and with them the birth of the Imperium of Man. Terror at the end of the 29th millennium was a world of nightmares. The cradle of humanity had become a charnel house, a planet-spanning battlefield where techno-barbarian warlords fought endless wars over the ruins of the ancient past. The great cities of the Dark Age had long since fallen, their towers toppled and their streets buried under centuries of ash and debris. What remained was a patchwork of petty kingdoms and savage tribes, each ruled by some despot or another, each fighting for survival in the radioactive wastelands that covered vast stretches of the planet's surface. The atmosphere itself was toxic in many regions. The oceans had boiled away or become chemical death traps, and the few pockets of relative habitability were contested with a ferocity born of desperation. The techno-barbarian warlords who ruled this shattered world had access to fragments of the technology from the Dark Age, enough to create terrible weapons, but not enough to restore civilization. They augmented their warriors with crude genetic modifications, sent them into battle wearing powered armor that was more prosthetic than protection, and armed them with weapons that could level mountains. The wars they fought were apocalyptic in scale, with battles lasting for weeks and body counts climbing into the millions. Mountains were shattered, continents were split, and the very geography of terror was reshaped by the violence that consumed it. Future imperial scholars would eventually dismiss these accounts as hyperbole, refusing to believe that such destruction was possible, but those who lived through it knew the terrible truth. It was into this hell that the Emperor emerged from his long hiding. He came from the region that had once been called Anatolia, leading armies that the techno-barbarians could not comprehend, and wielding power that made even the mightiest warlords seem like children playing at war. His first army consisted of the Thunder Warriors, those gene-enhanced soldiers he had been creating in secret for centuries. They were giants, standing head and shoulders above normal men, clad in armor that bore the lightning bolt symbol of their master. 20 legions strong, they marched across terror like an unstoppable tide, and where they went, resistance crumbled. The Thunder Warriors were designed for one purpose, and one purpose only: to kill. They were savage, brutal, and utterly without mercy. When they attacked a techno-barbarian stronghold, they did not take prisoners. They did not show compassion. They slaughtered their enemies to the last, leaving behind only corpses and the smoking ruins of whatever resistance had dared to stand against them. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. The Emperor had calculated that Terra had to be united quickly before the warp storms fully subsided and the opportunity for galactic reunification was lost. There was no time for diplomacy, no space for compromise. Submit or die. Those were the only choices offered to the techno-barbarian warlords. But the Emperor did not rely solely on the Thunder Warriors. He forged alliances where it served his purpose, offering those who would bend the knee a place in his new order. The Terrawat clan, one of the most advanced techno-barbarian nations, became one of his first allies, providing the advanced weaponry and armor that would equip his growing armies. From the Albion tribes, he gained fierce warriors who would become the foundation of his later Imperial army. And from Mars, still nominally independent but connected to Terra by ancient treaties, he secured the support of the Mechanicum, those tech priests who worshipped the machine god and commanded what remained of humanity's industrial capacity. Not every nation fell to Thunder Warrior assaults. Some, like Albia, proved too strong to be conquered by brute force alone. The Albions had their own proto-dreadnoughts, massive armored war machines that could match the Thunder Warriors in battle. They had Ironsides, soldiers clad in such heavy armor that they were essentially walking tanks. Battle after battle, the Thunder Warriors crashed against Albion defenses, and battle after battle, the Albions held. The casualties on both sides were staggering, and even the Emperor could see that continuing this path would bleed his forces white. So he did something unexpected. He called for a ceasefire. He came before the Albion clan lords unarmed, clad in white and crimson, and he spoke to them of his vision. He spoke of humanity united, of the stars waiting to be reclaimed, of a future where Terra would once again be the shining jewel at the heart of human civilization. And the Albions, recognizing both the futility of continued resistance and the merit in his words, bent the knee. The wars continued for decades, grinding on with the inexorable momentum of a landslide. The Ethnarchy, a powerful nation that commanded enslaved psychers and wielded weapons from the Dark Age, cost the Thunder Warriors 20,000 lives in the first assault on their strongholds alone. The losses were so severe that the Emperor was forced to wait to rebuild his forces before attempting a second attack. The Frank territories, Brazil, the Indonesic bloc, the Pan-Pacific Empire, each of these nations and 100 others fell, one by one, to the Emperor's advancing armies. Some capitulated quickly. Others fought to the last, their populations choosing annihilation over submission. The Emperor accepted these deaths with what appeared to be great sorrow, justifying the mountains of corpses with the argument that short-term suffering would lead to long-term salvation. And through all of this, at the Emperor's side, there was Malcador. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, perhaps the only being in existence that the Emperor considered a true friend. Where the Emperor was power incarnate, Malcador was subtlety and cunning. He managed the complex web of alliances and betrayals that the unification required. He identified which warlords could be turned, which had to be eliminated, and which could be useful tools even in death. It was Malcador who convinced the Emperor to take the title of Emperor itself, arguing that humanity needed a figurehead, a symbol around which to rally. The Emperor had been content to simply be the warlord, the conqueror, but Malcador understood that humans needed more than just victory. They needed something to believe in. And so, with some reluctance, the being who had walked through human history for 10,000 years accepted the title of Emperor of Mankind. By the time the Unification Wars reached their end, Terra had been transformed. Where once there had been countless warring factions, now there was only one power, the Imperium of Man. The Emperor's armies had conquered every nation, subjugated every warlord, and unified the planet under a single government. The population had been stabilized through genetic restoration programs designed to reverse the mutations and damage caused by millennia of radiation and chemical warfare. The factories were being rebuilt, the infrastructure restored, and the population organized into something that resembled a functioning society rather than a collection of warring tribes. The last battle of the Unification Wars was fought at Mount Ararat in what had once been the Kingdom of Urartu. Imperial chronicles would later record it as a glorious final stand, where the Thunder Warriors raised the banner of lightning to proclaim Terra's unity. They would say that Arik Taranis, the lightning bearer, the greatest of all Thunder Warriors, held that banner high before dying heroically of his wounds. It was meant to be a tale of sacrifice and glory, a fitting end to the warriors who had made the Imperium possible. But the truth was far darker, far more bitter. The Thunder Warriors had not died in battle at Mount Ararat. They had been betrayed. The Emperor, with his perfect foresight and ruthless pragmatism, had recognized that the Thunder Warriors were a problem. They were unstable, prone to berserker rages and cellular degeneration. They would never be suitable for the galaxy-spanning campaign he was planning. And more than that, they were dangerous. They knew too much, had seen too much, and their loyalty was to their own brotherhood rather than to the Imperium itself. They were a potential threat to everything he was building, and so he ordered their extermination. The Custodian Guard, the Emperor's personal bodyguards, and the newly created Space Marines, the next generation of enhanced warriors that would replace the Thunder Warriors, were sent to eliminate them. The Thunder Warriors, exhausted from the final battle and believing they were celebrating victory, never saw the betrayal coming. They were slaughtered where they stood, cut down by those they believed were their brothers in arms. A few survived the initial massacre, escaping into the depths of Terra to eke out shadowy existences in the underworld. Arik Taranis himself was among these survivors, living in bitter exile, his body slowly degrading from the genetic flaws the Emperor had deliberately engineered into the Thunder Warriors, knowing they would be disposed of once their usefulness ended. This was the price of the Emperor's dream. This was the kind of cold calculation that he considered necessary. The Thunder Warriors had served their purpose. They had united Terra, but they had no place in the Imperium that would spread across the stars. They were the bloody foundation upon which a more perfect creation would be built. Their sacrifice, like the sacrifice of so many millions who died in the Unification Wars, was simply another necessary step on the path to humanity's salvation. Terra was united. The preparations for the Great Crusade could begin in earnest. The Emperor turned his attention to the skies, to the countless human worlds scattered across the galaxy, isolated and alone in the darkness. It was time to bring them home. It was time to show humanity what it could become when united under his vision. The Thunder Warriors had given him Terra. The Space Marines would give him the galaxy. And nothing, not Xenos empires, not warp entities, not even the malevolent intelligence that had scattered his Primarchs across the stars, would stand in his way. The dream was beginning, the fall was still to come. With Terra unified under his rule, the Emperor could finally turn his attention to the stars. The warp storms that had raged for 5,000 years during the Age of Strife were finally beginning to subside. The birth of Slaanesh had concluded, and while the warp would never again be the calm realm it had been in humanity's ancient past, it was now navigable once more. ships could travel between the stars, albeit with great danger and difficulty. The isolated human colonies, cut off from each other for millennia, could finally be contacted and brought back into the fold. The Emperor's dream of a united humanity could at last become reality. But before he could launch his Great Crusade, the Emperor needed warriors unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. The Thunder Warriors, for all their brutality and effectiveness, had been merely a prototype, a rough draft of what was truly possible. The Emperor had been working on something far more sophisticated, far more perfect. This was the Primarch Project, perhaps the greatest achievement of genetic engineering in human history. Using his own genetic material as the foundation, the Emperor designed 20 superhuman infants, each one a masterpiece of biological engineering. These Primarchs, as they would be called, were intended to be generals for his armies, leaders who could command crusades across entire sectors of the galaxy. They would be immortal, impossibly strong, possessed of tactical genius, and utterly loyal to their father. Each one was unique, designed with specific attributes and purposes in mind, though what those purposes were remains a mystery even to this day. The Primarchs were gestated in specialized chambers deep within the Emperor's laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains. The Emperor poured his knowledge, his power, and his will into their creation. But he was not the only power interested in these embryonic godlings. The Chaos Gods, watching from the warp, saw the threat these beings represented. If the Emperor's plan succeeded, if humanity was united under his banner and guided away from the influences of the warp, then chaos would lose its greatest source of power and nourishment. The Chaos Gods could not allow this to happen. In a cataclysmic psychic assault, they struck at the Emperor's laboratory, tearing through his wards and defenses. Before the Emperor could react, the Chaos Gods reached into reality and snatched the Primarch infants, scattering them across the galaxy through the warp. Some accounts suggest it was not the Chaos Gods, but Erda, a fellow perpetual who had worked with the Emperor on the Primarch Project, who scattered them, believing that the Emperor's plans for his sons would doom them to become nothing more than weapons. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The Primarchs vanished, disappearing into the warp and emerging on distant worlds across the galaxy. The Emperor's perfect plan lay in ruins. 20 sons lost before they had even drawn their first breath. But the Emperor was nothing if not adaptable. He could not remake the Primarchs. The secrets of their creation were too complex, too intertwined with his own nature to be duplicated. But he still possessed something valuable, the genetic material that had been used as templates for the Primarchs. From this material, he created the Space Marines, warriors who were superhuman but not demigods, powerful but not unique. They would be organized into 20 legions, each one corresponding to one of the lost Primarchs, and each legion would eventually be reunited with its gene father when he was found. These Space Marines, the Legiones Astartes, would be the tip of the spear for the Great Crusade. They would be accompanied by the Imperial Army, millions upon millions of regular humans organized into regiments and equipped with the finest weapons that Terra could produce. The Titan legions, those cathedral-sized war machines, would provide heavy support. The Mechanicums Skitara would add their own unique capabilities. And over all of this, the Emperor himself would preside, directing the crusade with his perfect strategic vision. The Great Crusade launched in the 798th year of the 30th millennium. The Emperor divided his forces into expeditionary fleets, each one tasked with exploring a specific region of the galaxy, making contact with human worlds, and bringing them into compliance with the Imperium. Some worlds welcomed the crusade with open arms, desperate for reconnection with the rest of humanity after millennia of isolation. These worlds were brought into the Imperium peacefully, their populations celebrated as lost children returning home. Other worlds, whether through Xenos influence, chaos corruption, or simply because they had developed their own cultures and governments during the Age of Strife, resisted. For these worlds, compliance was achieved through force. The Space Marines would descend from the heavens in drop pods, laying waste to any military resistance. The Titans would level cities that refused to surrender. And if a world was deemed too corrupted to be saved, if its population had been mutated beyond recognition, or had fallen too deeply into worship of chaos, it would be subjected to exterminatus, total annihilation from orbit that would render the planet lifeless but deny it to the enemies of humanity. And as the Crusade spread across the galaxy, a miracle began to occur. The Primarchs, those lost sons scattered by chaos, began to be found. One by one, the expeditionary fleets would arrive at a world and discover that it was ruled by a being of incredible power and charisma, a warrior king or a legendary hero who had risen from nothing to dominate their entire world. These were the Primarchs, grown to maturity on their adopted homeworlds, each one shaped by the culture and conflicts of the planet where they had landed. Horus Lupercal was the first to be found, discovered on the hive world of Chthoniya, already a mighty warlord leading his own armies. The Emperor descended to meet his son, and Horus, recognizing his true father, pledged his loyalty immediately. He became the Emperor's favorite, the one who spent the most time at his side, learning the art of war and the science of conquest directly from the master of mankind himself. Leman Russ was found on Fenris, a death world of ice and monsters where he had been raised by wolves and had become the king of the barbarian tribes that inhabited that frozen hell. Rogel Dawn came from Inwit, where he had already established himself as a master of siege warfare and fortification. Robert Guilliman ruled the 500 worlds of Ultramar with such efficiency and wisdom that even the Emperor was impressed. Magnus the Red, discovered on Prospero, was the most powerful psyker among the Primarchs, a scholar and sorcerer who commanded abilities second only to the Emperor himself. Sanguinius, the angel, ruled Baal with wings of pure white and a nobility that made him beloved by all who met him. Each Primarch brought their own unique gifts, their own perspectives, their own strengths to the Crusade. The reunification of the Primarchs with their legions was a joyous occasion each time it occurred. The Space Marines, meeting their gene fathers for the first time, felt a connection that went beyond mere genetics. They were pieces of a whole, fragments of their Primarch's greatness given form. The legions took on the characteristics of their Primarchs. The Space Wolves became savage and loyal like Leman Russ. The Ultramarines adopted Robert Guilliman's tactical genius and organizational efficiency. The Blood Angels inherited Sanguinius's nobility and grace, and the Lunar Wolves, Horus's legion, became the exemplars of what Space Marines could achieve, the perfect balance of might and tactics. For 2 centuries, the Great Crusade burned across the galaxy. World after world was brought into compliance. Xenos empires that had plagued humanity for millennia were destroyed. The Orcs, those fungal horrors that seemed to exist only for war, were driven back again and again, though never fully eradicated. The Aeldari craft worlds, those remnants of the fallen empire that had birthed Slaanesh, were either avoided or destroyed, depending on whether they showed hostility toward the Imperium. Thousands of human colonies were rediscovered, their populations rejoicing at being reunited with Terra, or at least that is what the Imperial propaganda claimed. The reality was more complex. Many worlds did not want to be part of the Imperium. Many had developed their own cultures, their own governments, their own ways of life during the long night of the Age of Strife. They saw the Imperium not as liberators but as conquerors, imposing Terra's will through force of arms. The Emperor's vision for humanity was based on what he called the Imperial Truth. This was a philosophy that rejected all religion, all superstition, all worship of gods or supernatural entities. The Emperor declared that there were no gods, that the warp was merely a scientific phenomenon that could be understood and controlled, and that humanity's future lay in reason, science, and enlightenment. Any world that clung to religious beliefs was to have those beliefs forcibly eradicated. Churches were burned, priests were executed, and populations were re-educated to embrace the imperial truth. The irony, of course, was that the Emperor himself possessed powers that were essentially godlike. He could reshape reality with his thoughts, destroy armies with a gesture, and see through time itself. But he insisted he was merely a very advanced human, using science and psychic abilities that could eventually be replicated and understood. This rejection of religion would, in time, prove to be one of the Emperor's greatest mistakes. For the Chaos gods, watching from the warp, understood something the Emperor either did not or chose to ignore. Humans need faith. They need something to believe in, something greater than themselves to give their lives meaning. By denying them gods, the Emperor created a spiritual void that the forces of chaos would eventually fill. But that revelation was still years away. For now, the Crusade advanced, and the Imperium grew stronger with each passing day. The greatest triumph of the Great Crusade came at Ulanor, where the Emperor led his forces against the largest Orc empire ever recorded. The Orcs had conquered hundreds of worlds, building an empire that threatened to engulf a significant portion of the galaxy. The Emperor assembled multiple legions for the assault, committing the full might of the Imperium to this singular campaign. The Battle of Ulanor was titanic in scale, with millions of combatants on both sides. The fighting raged for months, the skies filled with burning ships and the ground covered in corpses. But in the end, it was the Emperor who struck the killing blow, personally slaying the Orc war boss whose psychic power had held the Empire together. With their leader dead, the Orcs fractured and fled, their empire collapsing in a matter of weeks. In the aftermath of Ulanor, at the victory celebration where Titans walked in parade and Space Marines from every legion gathered to honor their triumph, the Emperor made an announcement that would change everything. He named Horus Lupercal as War Master, giving him command over all the Imperium's military forces. Horus would continue the Great Crusade while the Emperor returned to Terra to work on a secret project. Some Primarchs were honored by Horus's elevation, recognizing him as the most capable among them. Others, like Perturabo and Angron, seethed with jealousy, feeling that they were equally deserving of the title. And a few, like Magnus and Lorgar, simply felt confused and abandoned, wondering why the Emperor was leaving them at the moment of their greatest triumph. The Emperor offered no explanations. He returned to Terra with only his custodian guard, descending into the dungeons beneath the Imperial Palace and beginning work on the project that had been his ultimate goal all along. This was the Imperial Webway Project, the culmination of everything he had worked toward for 10,000 years. And in his obsessive focus on this great work, in his failure to explain his actions to his sons, in his assumption that they would simply continue to serve him without question or doubt, the Emperor planted the seeds of the greatest disaster in human history. The dream was nearing its peak. The fall was drawing ever closer. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in chambers that had been sealed off from the rest of Terra, the Emperor worked on his greatest achievement. This was not the Primarch project, magnificent as that had been. This was not the Space Marine legions, impressive as they were. This was something that would fundamentally transform humanity's relationship with the galaxy itself. This was the Imperial Webway Project, and if it succeeded, it would render almost everything else the Emperor had done obsolete. It would make the Astronomicon unnecessary. It would make the navigators redundant. It would sever humanity's dependence on the warp entirely, protecting them from the predations of chaos forever. The Webway was not a human creation. It had been built in ancient times by the Old Ones, those mysterious beings who had shaped the galaxy long before humanity's ancestors had even crawled from the primordial seas. The Aeldari had inherited the Webway from the Old Ones, using it to create their empire that spanned the galaxy. Unlike the warp, which was a roiling dimension of pure psychic energy where physics had no meaning and demons lurked in every shadow, the Webway was a network of stable tunnels that existed in a subdimension between real space and the warp. Travel through the Webway was instantaneous, safe, and reliable. A ship could enter the Webway on one side of the galaxy and emerge on the other side mere hours later without having to risk the dangers of warp travel. The Emperor had discovered the entrance to the Webway long ago during the Dark Age of technology, or perhaps even earlier. Some accounts suggest he found it beneath the deserts of Asia, buried in ruins that predated human civilization. Others claim he stumbled upon it during his travels to the world of Molech, where a gateway into the realm of chaos itself existed. Wherever he found it, the Emperor recognized the Webway's potential immediately. If humanity could access this network, if they could travel through it as the Aeldari did, then the Imperium would be truly unified in a way that was currently impossible. There would be no need for dangerous warp jumps that could send ships centuries off course or deliver them into the waiting maws of demons. There would be no need for the Astronomicon, that psychic beacon that required such massive expenditure of power to maintain. The navigators, that guild of mutants who monopolized interstellar travel and wielded tremendous political power as a result, would become irrelevant. But accessing the Webway was not simple. The entrances were hidden and sealed, protected by Aeldari technology that the Emperor could not simply override. He needed to create his own entrance, his own gateway that would allow humanity to breach the Webway and claim it as their own. For this purpose, he had discovered or created a device called the Golden Throne. This was a massive construct of unknown design, possibly dating back to the Dark Age of technology, possibly even older. The Golden Throne had two primary functions. First, it was a powerful psychic amplifier, capable of taking the already tremendous psychic power of the Emperor and magnifying it 1,000-fold. Second, it could create a gateway into the Webway, a portal that would allow access to that hidden dimension. The Emperor installed the Golden Throne in the deepest chambers beneath the Imperial Palace, in what had once been his gene laboratories, where the Primarchs had been created. The throne was positioned above massive golden doors large enough that a Warhound Scout Titan could walk through them without bowing its head. These doors were the gateway, and through them the Emperor intended to build humanity's own extension into the Webway. He gathered tens of thousands of tech priests forming a special cadre called the Unifiers and set them to work constructing new tunnels that would connect to the existing Webway network. These tunnels were not made of the same psychically resistant material that the Aeldari had used. The secret of that material was lost, or perhaps had never been known to humanity in the first place. Instead, the Emperor himself maintained the psychic barriers that protected the human-built sections of the Webway from intrusion by demons and other warp entities. The project required nearly all of the Emperor's attention and psychic might. At first, this was manageable. The section of Webway that needed to be protected was small, and the Emperor could maintain the barriers while still performing his other duties as ruler of the Imperium. But as the construction progressed, as the human extension into the Webway grew longer and more complex, more and more of his power was required to keep it stable. This was why he had returned to Terra after Ulanor. This was why he had named Horus as War Master and delegated command of the Great Crusade. He could not be in two places at once, and the Webway Project had to take priority over everything else. The Emperor kept the project absolutely secret. He did not explain it to the Primarchs. He did not inform the Navigators, whose entire power base it would destroy. He told only Malcador the Sigillite and a handful of other trusted advisors. Even the tech priests working on the construction knew only their specific tasks, not the larger purpose of what they were building. This secrecy was necessary, the Emperor believed. If word of the project leaked, if the Navigators learned they were about to become obsolete, if the forces of chaos discovered what he was attempting, then enemies would emerge from every direction to sabotage his work. The project had to be completed in secret, or it would never be completed at all. There was one Primarch who the Emperor had specifically designed to play a crucial role in the Webway Project. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the master of psychic sorcery, and the most powerful psyker among all the Primarchs, had been intended from his creation to be the one who would maintain the Golden Throne and the Webway once it was completed. Magnus's psychic might was second only to the Emperor's, and while even Magnus could not match his father's raw power, he would be sufficient to maintain what the Emperor had built. The Emperor would use his power to create the Webway, and then Magnus would use his power to sustain it, freeing the Emperor to pursue the next phase of his plan, guiding humanity's evolution into a fully psychic species that was nevertheless protected from chaos corruption. But the Emperor never told Magnus about this destiny. He never explained to his son what he had been created to do, never shared the details of the Webway project, never offered Magnus the opportunity to prepare for the role he would eventually play. Perhaps the Emperor believed it was not yet time to reveal these secrets. Perhaps he feared that Magnus, for all his power, was not yet mature enough to be trusted with such knowledge. Or perhaps the Emperor simply did not think it necessary to explain himself to his creations. Whatever the reason, this failure to communicate would prove catastrophic. Magnus, brilliant and curious and obsessed with understanding the warp, pursued his studies of sorcery despite the risks. He delved into secrets that should have remained hidden, made bargains with entities that should never be bargained with, and grew ever more powerful in his command of the Imperium. The other Primarchs grew concerned. Leman Russ, who despised sorcery, even as he claimed his own rune priests were somehow different, argued that Magnus was courting disaster. Mortarion, whose own homeworld had been ruled by necromancers, wanted all psychers eliminated. Even Primarchs, who had their own librarians, their own psychically gifted warriors, began to question whether the study of the warp was worth the risks it posed. The tensions finally came to a head at the Council of Nikaea, where the Emperor convened all the Primarchs to debate the use of psychic powers within the legions. Magnus argued passionately for the continued study of the warp, claiming that knowledge was humanity's greatest weapon and that ignorance would doom them. Others argued just as passionately against him, pointing to the dangers that unchecked psychic power posed. The Emperor listened to all sides and then delivered his judgment. He banned the use of sorcery within the legions. Librarians would be disbanded, psychic powers suppressed, and anyone who violated this edict would face severe punishment. Magnus, devastated by this rejection, swore to obey his father's command, though in his heart he believed the Emperor was making a terrible mistake. What Magnus did not know, what none of the Primarchs knew, was that the Emperor's edict had nothing to do with the dangers of psychic power itself and everything to do with the Webway Project. The Emperor needed humanity to be ignorant of the warp's true nature, at least temporarily, because that ignorance would serve as a shield against chaos corruption. Once the Webway was complete, once humanity no longer needed to travel through the warp, then psychic studies could resume under controlled conditions. But until that moment came, knowledge of chaos had to be suppressed, even if that meant crippling one of humanity's most powerful tools against it. The Emperor returned to Terra and continued his work on the Webway. Month by month, year by year, the human extension grew longer, reaching deeper into the abandoned tunnels of the Aeldari network. The Emperor pushed himself to the limit, maintaining the psychic barriers while also trying to keep the Astronomicon functioning and fulfill his other duties as the ruler of humanity. He was stretched thin, perhaps dangerously so, but he believed the end goal justified the risk. Once the Webway was complete, once humanity could abandon the warp entirely, then everything would be worth it. The Great Crusade would continue with renewed vigor, connecting every human world through the Webway rather than through dangerous warp jumps. The Imperium would become truly invincible, united in a way that no empire in galactic history had ever been. The dream was so close to completion. The Emperor could see it, could almost touch it. Just a few more years of work, just a little more time, and the Webway would be finished. Humanity's future would be secured. Chaos would be starved of its power. The galaxy would belong to mankind at last. And then Magnus the Red, in his desperation to warn his father of Horus's betrayal, destroyed everything the Emperor had been working toward. In a single moment of hubris and good intentions, Magnus shattered 10,000 years of planning and plunged the galaxy into eternal darkness. The dream died, and the fall became inevitable. The betrayal did not begin with Horus. It began decades earlier with Lorgar Aurelian, the Primarch of the Wordbearers Legion, and his desperate search for something to worship. Lorgar had grown up on Colchis, a world steeped in religious tradition, and from his earliest days he had been consumed by the need to find the divine. When the Emperor arrived on Colchis and revealed himself to Lorgar, the Primarch believed he had finally found the god he had been searching for. Lorgar threw himself into the Great Crusade with religious fervor, converting every world he conquered not just to compliance, but to worship of the Emperor as humanity's one true god. But the Emperor did not want worship. He wanted compliance, expansion, and efficiency. While other legions were bringing dozens of worlds into the Imperium every year, Lorgar's word-bearers were converting a handful, spending months or even years on each world to ensure that the population properly understood the divinity of the Emperor. The Emperor's patience finally broke when he learned that Lorgar had built a perfect city on one world, a monument to the Emperor's glory, spending decades on its construction when that time should have been spent on the Crusade. The Emperor came to that world, that perfect city, and he brought Robut Guilliman's Ultramarines with him. And in front of Lorgar and his entire legion, the Emperor ordered Guilliman to destroy the city. The Ultramarines leveled it completely, reducing Lorgar's masterwork to rubble in a matter of hours. Then the Emperor forced Lorgar and every word-bearer to kneel, and he condemned them for their failure. He told Lorgar that there were no gods, that he himself was not divine, that faith and worship were chains that held humanity back, rather than tools that could elevate it. The humiliation was total, absolute, and devastating. Lorgar, whose entire existence had been built around faith, was told that the object of his faith rejected that worship. Something broke in the Primarch that day. If the Emperor was not divine, if there were no gods, then what was there to believe in? What was there to give life meaning? Lorgar's first chaplain, Erebus, provided the answer. Erebus had been a secret worshipper of chaos since before Lorgar's arrival on Colchis, and he saw in his Primarch's despair an opportunity. He whispered to Lorgar of other powers, older powers, entities that lived in the warp and welcomed worship. At first, Lorgar refused to listen, clinging to his faith in the Emperor despite everything, but slowly, inexorably, Erebus wore down his resistance. He arranged for Lorgar to have visions, to witness the power of the Chaos Gods, to understand that there were indeed divinities in the universe. They simply were not the Emperor. Lorgar, starved for something to believe in, embraced these new gods with the same fervor he had once directed toward the Emperor. The word-bearers took what they called the pilgrimage, traveling to the Eye of Terror itself, that massive tear in reality where the warp bled into real space. There, they communed directly with the Chaos Gods, and they learned terrible truths. They learned that humanity's psychic awakening was feeding the Chaos Gods, making them stronger with every passing year. They learned that the Emperor's Great Crusade, for all its apparent success, was actually accelerating this process by spreading humanity across the galaxy and increasing their numbers. They learned that the only way to survive in a galaxy ruled by chaos was to embrace it, to worship the dark gods and gain their favor, rather than futilely trying to resist them. And most importantly, they learned that the Emperor had been lying about everything. He knew chaos existed. He had even drawn power from the Chaos Gods when creating the Primarchs, stealing from them to create his sons. He was not ignorant of the warp's dangers. He was deliberately keeping humanity ignorant as part of some grand plan that even the Chaos Gods did not fully understand. Lorgar returned from the pilgrimage transformed. He was no longer the faithful son seeking his father's approval. He was a zealot, a true believer in new gods, and he was determined to enlighten all of humanity about the truth of chaos. But he was also pragmatic enough to understand that this enlightenment could not be achieved through mere preaching. Humanity was too deeply indoctrinated by the Imperial Truth. They would have to be forced to recognize the power of chaos, and that meant bringing the Chaos Gods fully into real space, unleashing demons across the galaxy until humanity had no choice but to acknowledge their existence. This would require a catastrophe so massive, so devastating, that the Emperor himself could not suppress knowledge of it. This would require the Horus Heresy. Erebus and Lorgar spent years laying the groundwork, carefully manipulating events and people to create the conditions for Horus's fall. They arranged for Horus to be wounded by a chaos-tainted blade on the world of Davin. They ensured that when Horus lay dying, his lieutenants would bring him to a temple dedicated to chaos for healing. They showed Horus visions of a future where the Emperor was worshipped as a god, where his sons were forgotten or dismissed, where Horus's achievements were attributed to the Emperor alone. These visions, carefully crafted lies mixed with just enough truth to be believable, broke Horus's spirit. He had always been the favored son, the one who stood at the Emperor's side, the war master who commanded all of his father's armies. But in those visions, he was nothing. Just another tool, discarded when no longer useful, just like the Thunder Warriors had been discarded at Mount Ararat. When Horus emerged from the temple, he was no longer loyal to the Emperor. He was convinced that his father had betrayed him, that the entire Great Crusade was a lie, that the Emperor planned to ascend to godhood and abandon his sons. The Chaos Gods whispered to him constantly now, promising him power, promising him the recognition he deserved, promising him the galaxy if only he would turn against his father. And Horus, wounded and bitter and filled with jealousy he had never known he harbored, agreed. Horus moved carefully, spending years converting his brother Primarchs to his cause. He appealed to each one's specific grievances, To Angron, who had been enslaved and forced to watch his gladiator comrades die while the Emperor looked on, Horus offered freedom and revenge. To Perturabo, who had been given the thankless task of siege warfare while Dawn received all the glory, Horus offered recognition. To Fulgrim, who sought perfection, Horus showed a path to transcendence through chaos. To Mortarion, who had been saved by the Emperor just before he could kill his adoptive father himself, Horus offered the chance to prove his own strength. Not all the Primarchs fell. Some, like Sanguinius and Dawn and Guilliman, remained utterly loyal. But 9 Primarchs joined Horus's rebellion, taking their legions with them. Half of the Space Marine Legion's humanity's mightiest warriors would soon turn traitor. On Prospero, Magnus the Red was pursuing his own studies of the warp, pushing deeper into mysteries that should have remained sealed. And then, through his scrying, he witnessed something that filled him with horror. He saw Horus's betrayal. He saw Lorgar and Erebus's manipulations. He saw the trap that had been laid for the War Master and recognized that if nothing was done, the Imperium would tear itself apart in civil war. Magnus knew he had to warn the Emperor immediately. But there was a problem. He was on Prospero at the far edge of the galaxy, and standard astropathic communication would take too long and might be intercepted by the traitors. He needed to contact the Emperor directly, mind to mind, no matter the distance. The Council of Nikaea had banned sorcery. Magnus had sworn to obey the Emperor's edict. But this was an emergency, a catastrophe that would destroy everything the Emperor had built. Surely his father would understand. Surely this one time, breaking the edict would be justified. Magnus gathered his most powerful sorcerers, and together they performed a ritual of unprecedented power, punching through the warp itself to send a message directly to the Emperor's mind. Magnus, in his desperation, did not consider the consequences. He did not wonder why such a spell would be so easy to cast, why the barriers protecting Terra would be so simple to breach. He was so focused on warning the Emperor that he never thought to question whether he was being manipulated. The psychic sending tore through the Emperor's carefully constructed wards like a cannonball through paper. Magnus's warning reached the Emperor's mind, but at terrible cost. The protective barriers around the Imperial Webway Project, the psychic shields that the Emperor had been maintaining for years to keep demons out of the human-built sections of the Webway, shattered like glass. The Golden Throne, that device which was meant to be the key to humanity's future, was damaged by the psychic backlash, and through the breach that Magnus had created, demons poured into the Webway by the thousands. They fell upon the tech priests working on the construction, slaughtering them by the hundreds before the custodian guard could respond. The human extension into the Webway, years of work and countless lives spent on its creation, was overrun in a matter of hours. The Emperor, who had been so close to completing his great work, who had been within reach of securing humanity's future forever, was forced to abandon everything. He mounted the Golden Throne not as a conqueror of the Webway, but as its jailer. He poured his psychic might into sealing the breach, into holding back the demonic tide that threatened to pour through the portal and into the Imperial Palace itself. The Custodian Guard and the Sisters of Silence fought a desperate war in the Webway, battling demons in the twisting tunnels, trying to buy time for the Emperor to close the gateway. Thousands of custodians died in that war. The Sisters of Silence were nearly wiped out entirely. And through it all, the Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne, every ounce of his concentration focused on keeping the demons at bay. The Emperor could not leave the throne now. If he did, even for a moment, the gateway would burst open and Terra would be flooded with demons. All of his plans, all of his preparations, everything he had worked toward for 10,000 years was reduced to this desperate holding action. And the worst part was that he could not even properly respond to Magnus's warning. The message had gotten through, yes, but the Emperor was so focused on containing the disaster that he could not spare the attention to verify what Magnus had said about Horus. He sent Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to Prospero to bring Magnus back to Terra to answer for breaking the edict, but Horus intercepted the order and twisted it, turning it from an arrest into an execution. The Space Wolves, believing they were following the Emperor's commands, devastated Prospero, killing thousands of Thousand Sons and driving Magnus to make a terrible bargain with the Chaos God Tzeentch to save what remained of his legion. And so the heresy began in earnest. Horus turned half the Imperium against the other half. Space Marines who had fought side by side for decades suddenly found themselves as enemies. Entire sectors burned as civil war consumed them. The Emperor, trapped on the Golden Throne, could only watch as his empire tore itself apart. He left the defense of the Imperium in the hands of Malcador and Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian of Terra, trusting that they could hold off the traitors long enough for loyalist reinforcements to arrive. The Webway Project, the great dream that would have saved humanity from the warp, lay in ruins. The Emperor was imprisoned on the Golden Throne, maintaining the seal on the broken portal, and Horus was marching on Terra, leading an army of traitors and demons, determined to topple the Emperor and claim the Imperium for himself. The dream had become a nightmare. The fall had truly begun. For 7 years, the Horus Heresy raged across the galaxy. Planets that had known peace for decades suddenly found themselves battlefields. Space Marines who had once been brothers slaughtered each other with a hatred born of betrayal. The traitor legions, empowered by chaos, had become something more and less than human. The Death Guard had been consumed by Nurgle's plagues, their armor rusted, and their bodies swollen with disease. The Emperor's children had fallen to Slanesh, becoming hedonistic monsters pursuing sensation beyond mortal understanding. The World Eaters had been claimed by Khorne, reduced to berserkers who could think of nothing but killing. The Thousand Sons were Tzeentch's puppets, their bodies turned to dust and their souls bound within their armor. The Loyalist legions fought desperately to stem the tide, but they were scattered across the galaxy, unable to coordinate their efforts, while the Emperor remained imprisoned on the Golden Throne. The Ultramarines, the largest legion, were trapped in Ultramar, fighting off the Word-Bearers who had corrupted the realm of 500 worlds. The Space Wolves and Dark Angels were too far away to respond quickly to any single crisis, forced to put out fires wherever they appeared. The Blood Angels, led by Sanguinius, had been ambushed at Cygnus Prime by a massive demonic force and barely survived. The Loyalist legions that remained in the Sol system, the Imperial Fists and the White Scars primarily, prepared Terra's defenses under Rogel Dawn's supervision, building fortifications that could withstand even Titan assaults. And then word came that Horus was bringing his entire fleet to Terra. All 9 traitor legions, accompanied by their chaos allies and millions of traitor Imperial army forces, were converging on the Sol system. Horus knew he was running out of time. The Ultramarines had finally broken free of the Word-Bearers' trap. The Dark Angels and Space Wolves were racing toward Terra at full speed. If Horus did not win quickly, he would be caught between the defenders of Terra and the arriving Loyalist reinforcements and crushed. He had to take Terra before the relief forces arrived. He had to kill the Emperor before Robuta Gilliman's Ultramarines and Lion L. Johnson's Dark Angels reached the Sol system. The traitor fleet emerged from the warp in overwhelming force. Thousands of ships, from massive battle barges to swift destroyers, appeared in orbit around Terra. The Loyalist fleet was outnumbered 10 to 1. They fought bravely, launching desperate attacks against the traitor armada, but they could not prevent the traitors from securing orbital supremacy. Within days, the sky above Terra belonged to Horus. Drop pods began to rain down on the planet's surface, each one containing dozens of Chaos Space Marines ready to kill and die for their Warmaster. Titans strode through the clouds, their void shields flickering as defensive batteries fired up at them, and deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the Emperor sat immobile on the golden throne, unable to intervene, forced to devote every ounce of his strength to keeping the Webway portal sealed. The siege lasted for 55 days, though those who lived through it would later claim it felt like 55 years. The fighting was apocalyptic in scale and ferocity. The Imperial Palace, that vast complex that covered a significant portion of the planet's surface, became the primary battleground. The palace walls, built to withstand any conceivable assault, were subjected to bombardment that would have leveled entire continents. Titan-class weapons fired constantly, their blasts shaking the very foundations of the palace. The traitor Space Marines threw themselves at the defenses wave after wave, accepting horrific casualties to gain even a few meters of ground. Rogel Dawn commanded the defense with the same methodical precision he had used in countless campaigns during the Great Crusade. Every wall was reinforced, every avenue of approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. The Imperial Fists, masters of siege warfare, made the traitors pay for every inch of ground in blood. But even Dawn's genius could not overcome the simple mathematics of the situation. The defenders were outnumbered. They were running out of ammunition, out of supplies, out of warriors to man the walls. And more than that, the enemy they faced was no longer entirely physical. Demons manifested wherever the fighting was thickest, summoned by the death and suffering that saturated the battlefield. Reality itself was beginning to fray around Terra as the warp pressed against the material universe. The Emperor, from his throne deep beneath the palace, felt every death, sensed every wound inflicted on his loyalists. He wanted desperately to intervene, to leave the Golden Throne and lead his forces as he had done during the Unification Wars. But he could not. The moment he released his hold on the Webway portal, demons would flood into the Imperial Palace and Terra would fall in minutes rather than days. He was trapped, forced to watch as his sons and his warriors died to protect him, unable to do anything to help them. Then came the day when Horus's fleet intercepted astropathic signals. The Dark Angels were close, the Space Wolves were approaching from another vector, and Robut Guilliman's Ultramarines, the largest loyalist force remaining, were less than a week away. Horus realized with cold clarity that his gambit had failed. He could not break through the palace defenses before the reinforcements arrived. Once they did, he would be trapped, his fleet surrounded, and his ground forces caught in a vice. He had one chance left, one final gamble that was so desperate, so insane that it just might work. He ordered the Vengeful Spirit, his flagship, to lower its void shields completely. It was a challenge, an invitation, and a trap all at once. He was daring the Emperor to come to him. Malkador the Sigillite, from his position in the throne room, sensed what Horus had done and immediately informed the Emperor. The Emperor knew it was a trap. He knew that Horus was hoping to lure him away from the Golden Throne, to force him into a confrontation where the Warmaster could use all the power the Chaos Gods had granted him. But the Emperor also knew that it was his only chance. If he could kill Horus, the traitor forces would collapse. The Chaos Gods would withdraw their support, the demons would return to the warp, and the surviving traitors would flee. The siege would end. Terra would be saved. Even if he could not return to the Golden Throne, even if his absence caused the Webway portal to burst open, Malkador would buy him enough time to kill Horus. It was a gamble, but it was the only gamble left. The Emperor called to him Rogul Dawn Sanguinius and Constantine Valdor, the Captain General of the Custodian Guard. Together, they would teleport aboard the Vengeful Spirit and confront Horus. Sanguinius objected. He had foreseen his own death at Horus's hands and believed that if he could face Horus alone, he might be able to change fate and kill his fallen brother. The Emperor overruled him, insisting that Sanguinius remain on Terra to coordinate the defense if the worst happened. But Sanguinius, the angel, the most noble of all the Primarchs, refused to abandon his father. He forced his way onto the teleportation team, knowing he was going to die, but unable to stand aside. The Emperor rose from the golden throne for the first time in years. His body, which had been seated for so long, groaned in protest. Malcador took his place, settling onto the throne and gasping as the psychic burden transferred to him. Even with the Emperor's warning, even with his own considerable psychic gifts, Malcador was not prepared for the agony of it. Maintaining the seal on the Webway portal was like trying to hold back an ocean with bare hands. Every moment was torture beyond description. But Malcador endured. He was the sigillite. He was the Emperor's oldest friend. If his death could buy the Emperor the time needed to kill Horus, then it was a price he would gladly pay. The Emperor, Dawn, Sanguinius, Valdor, and a company of the most veteran warriors from the Imperial Fists and Blood Angels and Custodian Guard teleported through the warp to the Vengeful Spirit. Horus, sitting upon his throne in the Lupercal's court, smiled as he felt them arrive. Then he activated the trap. Using his warp-fueled powers, he scattered the Loyalist forces throughout the massive starship. The Emperor appeared in one section, Dawn in another, Sanguinius in a third. The veterans found themselves separated from their leaders, forced to fight their way through demon-infested corridors while trying to locate the Primarchs. The Vengeful Spirit had been corrupted by years of exposure to the warp, its structure warped and twisted, its passages leading to places that should not exist. The Loyalists found themselves fighting not just Chaos Space Marines, but demons, cultists, and the very environment itself, which seemed to be actively trying to kill them. Sanguinius reached Horus first. The angel, his white wings stained with blood, his body bearing wounds from dozens of battles during the siege, stood before his fallen brother in the Lupercal's court. Horus tried one last time to turn Sanguinius, offering him power, offering him redemption, offering him a place at his side when Horus claimed the throne. Sanguinius refused, with tears streaming down his face, knowing that his death had come at last. Sanguinius attacked. The battle was brief but fierce. Horus had been empowered by all four Chaos gods. His strength was immeasurable, his power absolute. Sanguinius, exhausted and wounded, fought with everything he had, but it was not enough. Horus battered him down, impaled him with Worldbreaker, his massive mace, and cast the angel's broken body aside. As Sanguinius died, his blood spreading across the floor, his legion felt his death across the galaxy and were driven mad with grief and rage, the first manifestation of what would be called the Black Rage. The Emperor arrived to find Sanguinius's corpse and Horus waiting for him. Father and son faced each other across the throne room, and for a moment the Emperor hesitated. This was his son, his favorite, the one he had loved most. Even now, even seeing what Horus had become, the Emperor could not bring himself to unleash his full power. He hoped, against all reason, that some fragment of the Horus he had known remained, that somehow his son could be saved. They fought, and the battle was like nothing the galaxy had ever witnessed. It was not just a physical combat. though their blows shattered the deck and sent shockwaves through the massive vessel. It was a psychic duel, two godlike beings clashing in both the material world and the warp simultaneously. Horus, channeling the power of all four chaos gods, was stronger than he had any right to be. The Emperor, holding back because he could not bring himself to kill his son, was not fighting at full strength. Horus wounded the Emperor again and again. His lightning claw tore through the Emperor's armor. His mace shattered the Emperor's bones. His psychic blasts burned the flesh from the Emperor's face and destroyed one of his eyes. The Emperor, bleeding and broken, still could not bring himself to strike the killing blow. And then Horus, in his arrogance and his madness, made a mistake. He boasted, he claimed that he had bound the Chaos gods to his will, that he was the true master of chaos, that the Emperor's warnings about the warp had been lies designed to keep humanity enslaved. And in that moment, the Emperor saw the truth. This was not his son. Whatever Horus had been, whatever nobility and strength he had possessed, it was gone now. The thing standing before him was a puppet of chaos, a vessel for the dark god's will, and it had to be destroyed. The Emperor, with a sorrow that would echo through 10,000 years, unleashed his full power. The psychic blast that he directed at Horus was not meant to wound or cripple, it was meant to erase. The Emperor reached into Horus's soul and obliterated it, destroying not just his body but his very existence in the warp. Horus's corpse collapsed, the Chaos God's power fleeing as they abandoned their broken tool. For just a moment, at the very end, a fragment of the real Horus returned, freed from Chaos's influence. He looked at the Emperor with his own eyes, recognized what he had done, and begged his father to finish it, to make sure he could never be used by Chaos again. The Emperor, weeping, did as his son asked, burning away the last trace of Horus's existence until nothing remained but an empty shell. But the cost had been too high. The Emperor, already mortally wounded, collapsed. Rogel Dawn arrived to find his father dying and Horus dead. Dawn gathered the Emperor in his arms and teleported back to Terra, to the Imperial Palace, to the Golden Throne where Malkador sat burning. Malkador, his body reduced to ash by the strain of maintaining the seal, had only moments left. He saw the Emperor and knew what had to be done. With his last strength, Malkador transferred the burden back to the Emperor, giving his own life force to sustain his friend just a little longer. Then Malkador crumbled to dust, his sacrifice complete. The Emperor, his body broken beyond any hope of recovery, was installed upon the Golden Throne. He would never leave it again. He gave his last orders, speaking with a voice like the whisper of dying thunder. He commanded that the Codex Astartes be written, that the legions be broken down into chapters so that no one person could ever command the kind of power that Horus had wielded. He commanded that the Imperium continue, that humanity survive no matter the cost. And then he fell silent, his voice stilled, his body nothing more than a desiccated corpse kept alive by ancient machinery and the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every day. The dream had ended, the fall was complete. All that remained now was the long, slow decay of 10,000 years. 10,000 years, think about that. 10,000 years of sitting immobile, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to acknowledge the billions who pray to you. 10,000 years of constant psychic warfare, fighting demons in the warp, while also maintaining the Astronomicon, that great beacon that allows humanity's ships to navigate the galaxy. 10,000 years of being fed the souls of 1,000 psychers every single day, feeling each one burn out like a candle in a hurricane, their life forces consumed to sustain you. 10,000 years of watching your dream, your vision of humanity united and enlightened slowly rot into a fascist theocracy that uses your name to justify every atrocity imaginable. This is the Emperor's existence since the end of the Horus Heresy. This is what he endures every moment of every day. The Golden Throne sustains his body, keeping the last cells alive through a combination of life support technology and psychic energy. But his mind remains active in the warp, and it is there that the real battle is fought. The Chaos Gods, denied their victory at Terra, have never stopped trying to claim the Emperor for themselves. They send demons against his consciousness constantly, testing his defenses, looking for any weakness they can exploit. The Emperor must fight them all while also performing his other duties, must divide his attention between immediate threats and the long-term responsibilities that only he can fulfill. The Astronomicon is the most visible manifestation of the Emperor's continued activity. This psychic beacon, located in a massive chamber beneath the Hollow Mountain on Terra, is powered by 10,000 psykers called the Chosen. These psykers, gathered from across the Imperium by the Black Ships, are soul-bound to the Emperor in a ritual that links their life forces to his. The Emperor directs their combined psychic output, focusing it into a beam that extends roughly 70,000 light-years into the galaxy. This beam exists in both real space and the warp, allowing navigators to detect it and use it as a fixed reference point when plotting courses through the Immaterium. Without the Astronomicon, interstellar travel would become exponentially more dangerous. Ships would still be able to make short jumps, but the long journeys that connect one side of the Imperium to the other would be impossible. Maintaining the Astronomicon is only part of what the Emperor does. He also keeps the Webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace sealed. That gateway, broken by Magnus all those millennia ago, is still a wound in reality, a point where the warp presses against the material universe with terrible force. Demons still swarm on the other side, waiting for the Emperor's concentration to slip, even for an instant. If the portal bursts open, if those demons pour through, Terra itself would fall in hours. The Imperium would lose its capital, its spiritual center, and quite possibly its will to continue. The Emperor cannot allow this to happen, so he maintains the seal year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium. And then there are the more mysterious aspects of the Emperor's activity. The Emperor's Tarot, a method of divination used by high-ranking Imperial officials, seems to provide genuine guidance, with readings that prove accurate far more often than random chance would allow. Some claim the Emperor himself influences the cards, providing subtle direction to those who know how to interpret them. There are accounts of Imperial saints performing miracles that no normal human could achieve, feats of strength or endurance or healing that suggest divine intervention. The faithful attribute these miracles to the God Emperor, and while the Emperor would have rejected such worship during his life, it is possible that in his current state he has learned to use humanity's faith as a weapon, channeling their belief into actual power in the warp. The Imperial cult, which has grown to dominate all aspects of Imperial life, teaches that the Emperor is indeed divine, that he is the one true God of humanity, and that all other faiths are heresy. The ecclesiarchy, the religious arm of the Imperium, wields tremendous power, commanding billions of sororitas, the warrior nuns known as the Adepta Sororitas, or the Sisters of Battle. These women are fanatically devoted to the Emperor, and they wage war across the galaxy to spread his faith and punish heretics. The irony that the Emperor, who spent centuries fighting against religion, is now worshipped as a god, would be bitter if he retained the capacity to appreciate irony. But perhaps in some way he understands that humanity needs faith to survive in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. The Imperium that the Emperor created has become a grotesque mockery of his original vision, but it has also endured far longer than any rational analysis would suggest possible. The Administratum, that vast bureaucracy that manages the Imperium's quadrillions of citizens, is so inefficient that worlds can be lost in the paperwork for centuries before anyone notices. But it also processes an inconceivable amount of information and manages to keep the Imperium functioning despite the incredible challenges it faces. The Adeptus Mechanicus, which views technology as sacred mystery rather than understood science, has preserved far more knowledge from the Dark Age than might otherwise have survived. Their religious reverence for machines, while contrary to the Emperor's Imperial Truth, has resulted in careful maintenance and preservation of technologies that less superstitious societies might have allowed to degrade. The Space Marines, the Emperor's Angels of Death, continue to defend the Imperium across 1,000 battlefields. They are no longer organized into legions, following the wisdom of the Codex Astartes that Robute Guilliman wrote after the heresy. Instead, they are divided into roughly 1,000 chapters, each one 1,000 warriors strong, each one maintaining its own traditions and battle doctrines. They are the tip of the spear, the first responders when human worlds come under threat from Xenos invasions or Chaos incursions. They bear the Emperor's gene seed in their bodies, literally carrying a part of him into battle, and they fight with a fury born of absolute faith in his divinity. The Inquisition, that secretive organization that answers to no authority except the Emperor himself, hunts for heresy and corruption throughout the Imperium. Inquisitors have the authority to command armies, to destroy worlds, to execute planetary governors if they suspect chaos taint. They operate with minimal oversight, trusting to their own judgment and their faith in the Emperor to guide them. Sometimes they are heroes, saving billions through their vigilance. Other times they are monsters, condemning innocents to death because of paranoia or zealotry. But they are necessary because the threat of chaos is real, and even the slightest corruption can spread like a cancer if not caught and excised immediately. The Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, represents the vast majority of the Imperium's military force. Trillions of soldiers, drawn from countless worlds, equipped with whatever weapons and armor their homeworlds can produce, formed into regiments and sent to die on battlefields across the galaxy. They are not enhanced like the Space Marines. They have no special abilities, no gene seed, no augmentations. They are simply humans, ordinary men and women, given a lasgun and told to hold the line against horrors that should not exist. And somehow, through faith and discipline and sheer, bloody-minded determination, they do. They die in their billions, but they hold the line. The Emperor protects, they say, and they charge into battle believing it. But the Imperium is failing. Slowly, inexorably, it is losing ground to the forces arrayed against it. The orcs are endless, breeding wherever they go and coming back stronger every time they are defeated. The Tyranids, those extragalactic horrors that consume entire worlds, are arriving in greater numbers with each passing year, hive fleet after hive fleet emerging from the darkness between galaxies. The Necrons, those ancient machines that were once flesh and now sleep in tombs beneath millions of worlds, are awakening after 60 million years of slumber, reclaiming the galaxy they once ruled. The Eldari, both the Craftworld Eldari and the depraved Dark Eldar of Comora, continue to plague humanity with raids and manipulations. The Tau, a young species on the eastern fringe, offers the false promise of the greater good while slowly absorbing human worlds into their expanding empire. And through all of this, chaos remains the greatest threat, corrupting from within, turning humans against each other, offering power and damnation in equal measure. The Golden Throne itself is failing. The Adeptus Mechanicus, those tech priests responsible for maintaining the device, have done everything in their power to keep it functioning. They perform endless rituals, offer prayers to the machine god, and sacrifice servitors in the hope of appeasing the spirits of the machine. But they do not understand the technology they are maintaining. The Golden Throne dates from the Dark Age of technology, or perhaps even earlier, and the knowledge required to properly repair it was lost millennia ago. Each year, more systems fail. Each year, the burden on the Emperor increases. The number of psychers required to sustain him has quadrupled over the millennia. What once required 250 souls per day now consumes 1,000, and the rate is accelerating. There are those who claim the Emperor is dying, that the Golden Throne will fail within centuries or perhaps mere decades, and when it does, terror will be consumed by the demons waiting on the other side of the sealed portal. Others claim that the Emperor is already dead, that the thing on the Golden Throne is merely a corpse sustained by machinery and the psychic energy of the sacrificed psychers. They say that the apparent miracles and guidance attributed to the Emperor are either the product of humanity's collective faith, creating a psychic construct in the warp, or simply the result of coincidence and wishful thinking. And some, a very few, whisper that the Emperor's death might not be the end. They speak of the Star Child, a theory that the Emperor's soul, once freed from his dying body, will be reborn in a new form, perfected and purified, ready to lead humanity into a new golden age. But most of the Imperium simply continues grinding on day by day, war by war, death by death. They fight because there is no alternative. They die because that is what the Emperor requires. They worship because worship is all they have left. And through it all, the Emperor sits upon the Golden Throne, silent and unmoving, his consciousness stretched across the galaxy, fighting a war that will never end against enemies that can never truly be defeated. The dream is dead. The vision of enlightened humanity spreading across the stars, protected by reason and science, is gone forever. What remains is survival, bitter and brutal, and purchased at a price in blood that would have been unthinkable to the Emperor who launched the Great Crusade. But perhaps in the end, this was always inevitable. Perhaps the Emperor understood, even from the beginning, that the only way to protect humanity from the horrors of the galaxy was to become a horror himself, to sacrifice everything, including his own humanity, to keep his children alive in a universe that wanted them dead. 10,000 years, 10,000 years of darkness, 10,000 years of watching his dream become a nightmare, 10,000 years of enduring because the alternative is the extinction of the human species. This is the Emperor's fate. This is his eternal vigil. This is the price he pays so that humanity might survive for one more day, one more year, one more millennium. The Emperor protects, they say, and perhaps in his own terrible way, he does. And so we come to the end of our tale. Here, in the deepest darkness before whatever dawn may or may not come, the Emperor of mankind, who was born from the sacrifice of ancient shamans 10,000 years before the Common Era, who walked through human history, guiding and protecting his species from the shadows, who revealed himself at humanity's darkest hour and unified terror through blood and thunder, who launched the Great Crusade and nearly succeeded in his impossible dream of saving humanity from chaos itself, now sits entombed upon the Golden Throne, neither alive nor dead, sustaining the Imperium through sheer force of will. Think about the tragedy of it. Think about a being who possessed the power to reshape reality, who could have claimed divinity and been worshipped from the moment he revealed himself, who instead chose to champion reason and science and enlightenment. He wanted to guide humanity away from superstition, to help them evolve into a species that could stand as equals with the most ancient and powerful races in the galaxy. He dreamed of a human webway, of humanity freed from dependence on the warp, protected forever from the predations of chaos. He created the Primarchs to be his generals, to lead humanity's expansion across the stars, to serve as examples of what humanity could become. He built the Imperium to be a beacon of rationality in a galaxy gone mad. And he failed, not through lack of power or vision, but through the one weakness that perhaps even he could not overcome, the inability to understand his own creations as people rather than as tools. He created the Primarchs but did not think to raise them as sons. He found them scattered across the galaxy but did not explain to them his plans or his dreams. He demanded their loyalty but did not offer them his trust. He saw them as weapons to be used, as pieces on a board to be moved according to his strategy, and he was genuinely surprised when they reacted with human emotions like jealousy and betrayal and hurt. He made the Thunder Warriors to unify terror but disposed of them when they had served their purpose, never considering that they might see that betrayal as a warning of their own eventual fate. He banned sorcery at Nikaea without explaining the Webway Project, without helping Magnus understand why the study of the warp was so dangerous at that particular moment. He retreated to Terra to work on his secret project without preparing Horus for the burden of commanding the Great Crusade alone. At every critical juncture, the Emperor chose secrecy over communication, control over trust, and each time he made that choice, he planted another seed of the disaster to come. Perhaps it could not have been otherwise. Perhaps a being who has lived for 10,000 years, who has witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, who has seen humanity at its best and its worst, simply cannot relate to mortals as peers. Perhaps the Emperor's greatest flaw was not cruelty or arrogance, but simple loneliness, the isolation of being the only one of his kind, unable to share his burdens or his vision with anyone else because no one else could possibly understand. Malcador came close, but even Malcador was not truly his equal. The Emperor was alone, and in his loneliness he made choices that doomed his dream. And yet, even in failure, even corrupted into something he would have hated, the Imperium endures. Humanity survives. The species that the Emperor loved and protected for 10,000 years before revealing himself continues to exist, continues to fight, continues to believe that tomorrow might be better than today, even though all evidence suggests otherwise. Is that enough? Is survival, purchased at the cost of all joy and hope and progress, actually worth it? The Emperor cannot answer that question anymore, if he ever could. He can only continue his vigil, holding back the darkness for one more day, protecting humanity with his last dying strength, because that is what he has always done, and because he cannot imagine doing anything else. The faithful say that the Emperor protects, and perhaps they are right. Perhaps his consciousness, stretched across the galaxy and fighting battles in the warp that no mortal could comprehend, truly does shield humanity from threats they cannot even perceive. Perhaps the miracles attributed to him are real. Perhaps the saints who bear his blessing truly are touched by divine power. Perhaps the faith of billions is not misplaced. Or perhaps the Emperor is simply a corpse, kept barely alive by technology that no one understands, and by the sacrifice of 1,000 psykers every day. And the Imperium endures not because of him, but in spite of him, held together by bureaucratic inertia and the sheer stubbornness of humanity, refusing to surrender even when all hope is lost. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. The Emperor is not the omnipotent god the ecclesiarchy claims, but neither is he merely a corpse. He endures, diminished but not defeated, protecting what he can, while the galaxy slowly tears itself apart. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps survival, no matter how bitter, is victory in a universe that wants nothing more than to see humanity extinguished. Perhaps the Emperor's greatest achievement is not the Imperium he built, but the fact that humanity still exists at all, still fights, still believes that they have a place among the stars, even though every other species in the galaxy seems determined to prove otherwise. So close your eyes now and think about that figure on the golden throne. Think about the Emperor who gave everything for his species, who sacrificed his own existence to keep humanity alive. Think about the weight of 10,000 years, the burden of protecting quadrillions of souls, the endless grinding pressure of maintaining consciousness when oblivion would be such a relief. Think about what it costs to be the Emperor, and think about whether that cost is worth paying. The Imperium says yes. The billions who die in his name every day, the psychers who burn out like candles to sustain him, the soldiers who charge into hopeless battles, screaming his praises, all of them say yes. Survival is worth any price. Humanity is worth any sacrifice. The Emperor protects, and that is enough. But is it enough for you? As you drift towards sleep, as this story fades into dreams and half-remembered fragments, ask yourself whether the Emperor's dream, corrupted as it has become, was worth pursuing. Ask yourself whether a species that survives only through endless war and oppression and suffering is really surviving at all, or whether it has already died and simply doesn't know it yet. The Emperor cannot answer these questions. He can only continue his vigil, protecting humanity for as long as his strength endures, hoping that perhaps somehow, someday, his children will find a way to thrive rather than merely survive. The Emperor protects. Say it as a prayer, as a hope, as a curse, as a question. Say it and believe it, or say it and doubt it, or say it and make of it whatever truth you need it to be. The Emperor protects. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, perhaps that is the only truth that matters. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the rise and fall of the Master of Mankind. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to like and subscribe. There are so many more stories to tell from the darkness of the 41st millennium. So many more tragedies and triumphs to explore. Until next time, sleep well, and may the Emperor protect you from whatever nightmares lurk in the void. The Emperor protects, always.